Thank you, everybody, for coming to the Aaron Torres Podcast YouTube page. I do have one quick favor before we get to the video that you came here for, and that is very simply this. You see that little red subscribe button below this video? Go ahead, smash that subscribe button. It really does help me. It really does help this channel grow and my audience grow. So go ahead and hit that red subscribe button. And now, here is the video that you came here for. All right, so let's get into the topic of the day, which frankly I believe is really not just the topic of the day, but really the topic of the last 2, 3, 4 weeks in college basketball. We have been talking about a potential staff shakeup at the University of Kentucky basically since the season ended, but really the last 2.5, 3 weeks is when things have heightened as 2 assistant coaching spots have opened. Joel Justice leaves to become the associate head coach at Arizona State. Tony Barbee takes the head coaching job at Central Michigan. You knew John Calipari was going to swing for the fences with these coaching hires. And oh, by the way, he didn't just do that. He hit a grand slam. As 2 of the elite assistant coaches in college basketball, Chin Coleman and Orlando Antigua, both from the University of Illinois, are now headed to Kentucky to spearhead the rebuild of Kentucky basketball. And before we get into all the details and this and blah, 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 let me just say this. Let me just say one thing. Say what you want about John Calipari. He is the $8, $9, $10 million man, and there is no excuse for what happened last year. But what I would also say is in an offseason where he has already addressed the roster with a bunch of shooting, a bunch of transfers, really upgraded the talent on the roster, this is about the most gangster move that he's made in his entire coaching career at Kentucky, at least off the court. It doesn't top winning a national championship. It doesn't top winning SEC tournament championships. It doesn't top having 3 number 1 overall picks, Karl-Anthony Towns, Anthony Davis, and John Wall. But to coming off one of the worst seasons in program history, go out and get the 2 best assistant coaches off maybe the best staff in college basketball, that's about as gangster as it gets. So shout out to John Calipari. But let's get into the background because I think a few different things here are important. And I think the first one is pretty simple. If you've watched the University of Kentucky over the last couple years, one thing is apparent. The talent level that program had 3, 4, 5, 6 years ago, not even 3, let's say 8, 9, 10 years ago, it has not been the same at Kentucky over the last 3, 4, 5 years. That directly correlates, by the way, to the fact that there was a major coaching staff shakeup about 7 years ago when Orlando Antigua, who was John Calipari's right-hand man during the glory days of the University of Kentucky run under Calipari, Orlando Antigua left the program in 2014 to become the head coach at the University of South Florida. It doesn't work out there as a head coach. He then goes to the University of Illinois and helps build that program back up. But if you've watched Kentucky over the last 4, 5, 6 years, the caliber of player on that roster just has not been the same at the University of Kentucky. Go back to the early Calipari era. You had John Wall. You had DeMarcus Cousins. You had Eric Bledsoe. You had Anthony Davis, Michael Kidd-Gilchrist, Karl-Anthony Towns, on and on and on and on and on. And you just haven't had the same caliber of player. Now, you've had a good player here, a great player there, a player that becomes a great player in the program like Emmanuel Quickley. But John Calipari, when he got to Kentucky, the entire premise of what he was going to do was centered around one thing. He was going to recruit the best of the best high school players in the country and then figure it out from there. And John Calipari's system only works when you have a John Wall, a DeMarcus Cousins, an Anthony Davis, a Michael Kidd-Gilchrist. When you have the number 1 player in America, it's a lot different than having the number 16 player in America as the signature player in your recruiting class. I've talked about it before. There's a difference between the number 1 pick in the NBA draft and the number 11 pick in the NBA draft. When you have the number 1 pick in the NBA draft, you got to get it right. You got to get a franchise-changing superstar, whether it is Zion, Ben Simmons, Anthony Davis, even Anthony Edwards. I was critical of Anthony Edwards. He's been awesome in the NBA. Well, same with college basketball. The difference between signing the number 1 player in America and building around him and the number 11 player in America and building around him is a lot different. And unfortunately, really since Orlando Antigua left this program, Kentucky has not gotten those same players. And so with John Calipari, what I want to say, and then I'll get into some more of the details from this weekend, is there was really coming off this year only one move that he could make to appease the fan base. Sure, you can sign this recruiter, this transfer, or this, or this, that, but it was clear that the entire foundation of what he built and what he had done, how he had built Kentucky, the entire foundation had cracked. You're no longer getting those elite players. You're no longer building around them. And in some cases, you were getting 2, 3, 4 elite players in a high school class. That hadn't happened, and so when the season ended, there was really only one move that John Calipari could make that would truly appease the entire fan base, and that was going out and getting Orlando Antigua. His right-hand man, the guy that brought him so many great players, helped him recruit. I don't want to say brought, because that implies that John Calipari didn't do any of the work himself and that nobody else on the staff was recruiting with Orlando Antigua, which simply isn't true. But Orlando Antigua was the point person for most of the marquee players of the early John Calipari era, and the only thing John Calipari could do was go out and get Orlando Antigua. That was the only thing he could do to appease the entire fan base, to get them happy, to get them back on his side, to get him believing that he was going to do what it took to fix this program. And so credit to John Calipari, because not only did he do that, he went out and got the second best assistant coach at Illinois, Chin Coleman, who is an elite recruiter in his own right. You pair those two with Jay Lucas, who was an elite recruiter at Texas, who was on the staff this past season. And I'm just telling you, Kentucky just put together probably the best coaching staff in college basketball. An argument could be made for Chris Beard's new staff at Texas, which has 2 former head coaches on it. But this was John Calipari. What I call it is his Death Row Records moment, okay? Death Row Records, you can Google it if you're under 30, but essentially in the mid-90s, there was a record company called Death Row Records, Suge Knight. He went out and signed all the top rappers, and he said, look, we are coming for you, okay? And that's basically what John Calipari did this offseason, because you look at the coaching staff that's now in place. You have an elite recruiter in Orlando Antigua whose specialty is New York, New Jersey, Karl Anthony Towns. Why am I blanking? Michael Kidd-Gilchrist on this Illinois team, Andre Curbelo and Kofi Coburn. You have Chin Coleman, who recruited Ayo Dosunmu to Illinois, very plugged in Chicago. You have Jay Lucas, very plugged in at Texas, helped Greg Brown end up at University of Texas. And so this is John Calipari's Death Row Records moment of like, hey, from New York to Texas, we basically got the entire country covered. Any top player we are going to go after. I am going to come in and close, but I am unleashing my Bulldogs on the recruiting trail this offseason. So that is why it is huge. That is why it is big. And all of a sudden, there is so much energy back in the University of Kentucky, the program, the hype, the excitement. And I think this is a really fun thing for college basketball, right? Because I've kind of mentioned this loosely. I don't know if I've mentioned it on this show specifically, but college football, we see these kind of, landscape-changing things, and we're going to talk about one of them in a minute with a transfer portal. But about 10, 12 years ago in college football, it was facilities, right? Everybody had to have that elite facility with the juice bar and the this and the that and the waterfall. And then everybody had the waterfall. So what's next? Then you start paying for a ton of assistant coaches. Nick Saban, Kirby Smart, whoever, Jim Harbaugh, Ryan, whoever it is, you're paying your coordinator $1 million, $1.5 million, $2 million, whatever it takes to help you win. And I feel like we're starting to see that in college basketball now, where all of a sudden the value of assistant coaches is going up. I mentioned the Texas situation where Chris Beard got 3 elite assistant coaches, really 4, one of them being his special assistant. And now John Calipari breaking the bank to upgrade his coaching staff. And I'm really excited about the future of Kentucky basketball. Now, what I will say, first of all, bringing in a bunch of assistant coaches doesn't guarantee anything. And on top of that, what I would also say is that one thing that did concern me, and if you listen to my interview with Jack Pilgrim last week, we talked a lot about this, is the idea of, yes, the entire program was built on recruiting the elite of the elite, the best of the best. And my concern was John Calipari going back in time to a playbook that no longer exists, okay? And this was one of my concerns when these hires was made was, well, it's easy to say, hey, if I go get these 2 top recruiters, we're going to recruit all the best players in America. Just one problem. All the best players in America don't go to college anymore. Some of them go to the G League. Some of them go the professional route. Some of them, obviously, this new overtime league, which we might talk about here momentarily. But, you go to this overtime league. You have a bunch of options. And on top of that, Anthony Edwards, Ben Simmons, Markelle Fultz, they kind of proved you don't need Kentucky. You don't need Duke to become the number 1 overall pick and a high-caliber NBA draft pick. And so that was one of my concerns. But as we transition into what it now means for the future of Kentucky, let me first say this. I watched the press conferences of Orlando Antigua and Chin Coleman on Saturday morning, and I came away really impressed with their philosophy going forward. Because what I was afraid of was, we're going to hit the ground running and we're going to sign all the top players. And that's just not realistic in 2021. And so what I loved about Orlando Antigua was he kind of admitted, look, the landscape has changed a lot since I was here from 2009 to 2014. But what we are still going to do is target the top players that we can that truly are interested in coming to college basketball, because this place, Kentucky, still offers an experience that not really many other places do. And yes, there are going to be those families that they don't care about college. They just want to get their kid as much money as soon as they possibly can. And if that's the case, for the record, Aaron Torres, don't blame them. I know nobody in basketball, Orlando Antigua, John Calipari blames them. But what Orlando Antigua said was like, look, the G League offers a really cool alternative, but it is just an alternative. And it's funny, right? Mike Boynton has said that on this show. Mike Boynton, the head coach at Oklahoma State who recruited Cade Cunningham, he's like, look, the G League is an alternative. It's a really great alternative for some people, but college is a really great alternative for some people. And I love that Orlando Antigua basically said that in his introductory press conference. He said, look, we're not going to be able to get all of them, but we didn't get all of them before. But the ones that are serious about the educational aspects, starting on the path towards a college degree, and oh, by the way, having a stage that really only Kentucky and a handful of other schools can provide with the not only the facilities, but the games that you play, the stages that you're on. You're playing North Carolina, you're playing Duke in the Champions Classic. We're going to go after those guys, and we're going to try to get those guys, and I believe that they will. On top of that, and I should mention, by the way, when I say they're going after those guys, I ain't joking, because, oh, by the way, Kentucky, as soon as they signed Chin Coleman and Orlando Antigua to their contracts, they got a bunch of crystal balls for Ty Washington, one of the top high school players left that is uncommitted for next year. So you talk about going after top players. They ain't slowing down right away. Got a bunch of crystal ball predictions for one of the top players in high school basketball, Ty Washington. I know others, including my buddy Jack Pilgrim, have suggested they should go after Jaden Hardy, who might just be the best player in this class. I have heard that he is already bound for the G League and a professional pathway, but I only bring it up because it is clear that right away they're hitting the ground running, wasting no time, and there may be a big commitment here in the next week to the University of Kentucky, which should really springboard this staff as they head out on the road in June to start recruiting the class of 2022. So that's kind of the big picture. One last thing that I would say, and it's something that I talked to Jack Pilgrim about as well. I think these coaching staff hires are important for a number of different reasons, most of them being the recruiting stuff that we just talked about. But what I would also say is on top of all that, there is another element as well. And it is kind of, I think, going to bring Kentucky, I think these two coaching staff hires are going to bring Kentucky back to the roots of how John Calipari built this program, not just from the recruiting perspective, the best of the best, all that stuff, but from the family perspective that I do believe has been lacking over the last 2, 3, 4 years. Now, it wasn't as bad when Kenny Payne, the top assistant, was there the last couple of years, but this past year there was clearly a disconnect. And it's really interesting, right? If you listen to this podcast regularly, I talked about this back in, I think it was December. But when you watch Kentucky, one thing that stood out to me, and Jack Pilgrim and I talked about it last week, I don't know how much actual coaching was going on last season behind the scenes outside of John Calipari. And it's no disrespect to the guys that were on that staff, because all of them were being pushed into new roles, and maybe they were roles that they weren't comfortable with. But the one thing that I really respected about the Orlando Antigua and Chin Coleman press conferences, they both talked about how important player development, relationships, bridging that gap, becoming a family are, right? And that is one thing that I do think was lacking, and one thing that I think not only was lacking from the assistant coaches, but John Calipari as well. Last year, when John Calipari, basically, you watch the Kentucky game, it was Calipari yelling, screaming. Players come back to the sideline. No assistant coach, nobody comes, pats him on the back, tells him it's going to be okay. And so I think what Orlando Antigua specifically will bring is kind of what Jack Pilgrim talked about last week, something that I wrote about throughout the week, and that is the idea that you need a good cop for John Calipari's bad cop. It's something that I believe was lacking last year. It was something that I do believe it just, you watch those games and it just felt like there was a major disconnect between the coaching staff and the players, and I believe Orlando Antigua will be able to bridge that gap. Chin Coleman will be able to bridge that gap, and you will have more of that family environment. Kentucky, John Calipari, he has what's known as La Familia, which is basically like once you're part of our family, you're always part of our family, and I did feel like that was lacking as well. I love that Orlando Antigua, one of the great things that he did early in his Kentucky career, he was that bridge, he was that good cop to John Calipari's bad cop. And so all I'll say is, I really love these hires, and it doesn't guarantee anything. It doesn't guarantee national championships. It doesn't guarantee SEC championships, but these were the moves that John Calipari had to make to have Kentucky back to where they need to be. And what will be interesting is to see what happens next with this program going forward. As I said, I think we're all expecting a commitment from Ty Washington, one of the top players in high school basketball, over the course of the next week, but just a huge, mega, marquee moment in the John Calipari era. And if this thing is going to get back on track with John Calipari as head coach, this was the move that had to